Good morning. Today in worship, we hear the story of the promise that God makes to Abraham, where God promises that he will be the father of a great many people. And Abraham at first believes the promise. Later, we hear that as he grows old and his wife is old as well, that when the promise is restated to him, that he laughs. As God makes this promise, he has Abraham look up at the stars and tells them that, if you can count the stars, that's the depth of how many descendants you will have. Later, we see the promise being told again, and this time Sarah laughs. That story is found in Genesis chapter 15 through chapter 18. That's a bit longer story. Anyway, look at the stars. Count them if you're able. If you want to understand God's plan, the abundance of God's blessing and God's love, count the stars. Or perhaps you could go to a beach and count the grains of sand, and in that number you might find the depth of God's intended blessing for those that he loves. Or if you are in a field or a path and have the prestigious job of picking rocks, as has been my task from time to time in my life, you might discover an answer to the great mystery, which is the mystery of what lies beneath the rocks that you are picking. For under each rock you will find that there is another rock, and should you pick that rock, surely you will once again be rewarded with another rock. This is true especially when you live on a mountain in Montana, which is essentially a giant pile of rocks. I mean, they even call them the Rocky Mountains. Thus, we concluded as kids, assigned the glorious task that the reward for our labors would be nothing more than a healthy dose of job security, which would have been good news if we were being paid, but really, who can put a price on such a valuable experience? But if you were to look at it in another way and consider each rock to be a blessing, and then your blessings would be unlimited, just as are God's mercies for us. Abraham had his stars to count, and I have counted rocks. To each their own, I guess. Anyway, with this reminder of God's abundance of blessings for us in life, let's turn to our reading and consider the story of Abraham and Sarah and the promise of God's blessing that comes to them, a promise that reaches through the centuries and the generations to this very time and place, to the people that's called themselves the church. The women's group in the last few weeks has looked at this story, and then our Sunday school kids have been spending some time here. And it's a story that's been told before, and so it should be somewhat familiar to us. But as a refresher, Abraham and his wife Sarah were a couple that came from a land called Ur. Ur is actually in modern-day Iraq. And we know that place from our own conflict with them, with Iraq. But Ur also became Babylon, and which is the great and mighty empire that crushed the people of Israel, and really stood for all evil and empirical distrust that the people had towards the empire. Anyway, the place has long been a place of conflict. One day, God came to Abraham and called for him to travel from his home in Ur to the land of Canaan, later known as Israel. Once again, our story moves to another place of perpetual conflict. But there, God would establish this couple as the first of a family that would carry forth God's will and blessing in the world. They were chosen to be the family of God that would work through this world. But I have to ask, why this couple? In some ways, it seems a little bit obvious they're chosen because they listen to God and obey. They believe in God and God's promise. But on the other hand, they have a lot of strikes against them. While they believe in the promise, they also laugh at God's promise, both of them. So how much do they actually believe it? Plus, they are too old for this. They are far from perfect in their own approach to life or in their relationship with each other. This great father of faith is really not the best of husbands, as he hides behind his wife and is ready to pass her off to other men in order to save his own skin. Later, he's not the greatest example of a father, as he casts one son out into the wilderness to die and nearly kills his other son. Now, together, this couple goes outside of God's plan to try and have a child through a form of surrogacy, I guess you could say. And then we see that Sarah is not the picture of what it is to be a saint. She schemes to go around God and then is jealous and petty toward other women that she has power over. In jealousy, Sarah pushes people away. And the more that I look at the story, the more I'm caught up in the messiness of it. Abraham and Sarah come from places of conflict and then enter into another place that is full of conflict. Their entire lives are conflicted and really messed up. And along with the character flaws that follow them, things don't even exactly work out the way they should. They go to this great promised land in the story and then immediately have to go to Egypt to avoid famine. They then return and get into fights with their neighbors. Their deep flaws and a lot of their dysfunction flows from them into their children and grandchildren. This is a messy story about a messy family. And yet, there's a promise. For whatever reason, God chose this unlikely couple to be the bearers of that promise. And that is a promise that has bearing in our lives. It's the promise of descendants. And those descendants will have an important role in bringing about God's work in the world. Most importantly for us, it's out of this family, out of the line of Abraham, that Jesus comes. I look at the stars and I remember this story and remember this promise. It's a beautiful story of life when life should not be possible. It's a story that touches me, for, as we hear in the letters of Paul, we are adopted into this great family of Abraham through the bidding of Christ. And thus, we are among those children of God promised to Abraham. We are among the stars that cannot be counted. This is a story of faithfulness and redemption, of promise and love. For some reason, God reaches into that messiness in the world and blesses it, and blesses this couple. God turns their messiness and hopelessness into promise and hope. So maybe when I look at the stars, or when I visit the beach and feel the sand in my toes, or when I pick a rock out of a field, I might be reminded of the messiness of the universe, and that God's promise covers over that messiness in a way that I cannot hope to measure. For into this messy world, God sent his son, a descendant of Sarah and Abraham, to be the light that shines in the darkness, to be our salvation and our release from the messiness of the world, to be a rock worth picking. Amen.